SoundCartel.
Does the word Adtech either send a shiver down your spine or make your eyes glaze over? Well, in today's episode, Bryan Barletta of Sounds Profitable is going to hopefully change that as he breaks down what you need to know in simple terms and, importantly, provides advice on how to use podcasting Adtech to your advantage.
The analytics and attribution is really great. It's very accessible, very affordable, and honestly, it's very easy to set up. So I think everybody should really explore it and always feel free to have conversations with these partners about how they handle data, your privacy rights, and all of that, because most of them are set up to process the data, which means that if they're the processor, it means you own it. And if you own it, learn your rights.
I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of audio agency SoundCartel, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 2 of season 5. And joining me is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hello, Nick. Now, you know how excited I get by Adtech, so I'm very much looking forward to this interview.
Yes, it can be a touch dry and also complicated for me, but our guest in this ep is so passionate and definitely knows how to talk about it in a way that we can all understand. But before we get to Bryan, the annual Infinite Dial 2021 report has just been released by Edison Research and Triton Digital. These annual reports have covered a wide range of media topics since 1998, and importantly for us, has covered podcasting since 2006, making it the most comprehensive set of survey results in existence. So, Nicole, the results are in. What are the highlights? Keeping in mind that this is a US survey, the Australian-specific data will be released later in the year.
As expected, things kept trending up. Podcast familiarity increased from 75% to 78%, which represents 222 million people. And the number of people who have ever listened to a podcast increased to 162 million, which was a 2% increase to 57%. It was the weekly listeners, though, that had the biggest jump, and that was up 4% to 28%, or 80 million people. I was a little surprised, though, that the ever-listened figure didn't increase more.
Yeah, I agree that because of the pandemic and all the extra podcasts that were released last year that we discussed in the previous episode, I thought that may have jumped up a little bit as well.
That's right.
But I think putting it into perspective, the number has doubled in less than a decade.
Yeah.
And things can change pretty quickly when new technology arrives on the scene. Social media, for example, also in the report, for those aged 12 to 34, in the last 6 years, Facebook's share has dropped from a huge 62% down to 21%. And the big thief, do you know who it is?
TikTok?
It is. TikTok, 14% share in that demographic in this survey. They only had 3% last year.
It's incredible.
So it really highlights how quickly trends can change.
Yeah.
So overall, podcasting might plateau a little bit, but you would expect that after 10 years of growth. And for those that are listening to podcasts regularly, they're listening more often and to more episodes each week.
Yeah, that's right.
And just quickly, other observations to note were that smart speaker ownership grew by a huge 22%, probably pandemic related.
I dare say that's right, Nick. People were home a lot more often in the last pandemic year. It makes absolute sense that they'd want to have access to audio on demand, and no surprise to see that in the results.
Yeah, and for households that have one speaker, last year we saw them buying multiple speakers in their house. Yeah. Tablets and watches have both plateaued, while mobile phones have increased again, making them by far the most important device for media consumption. Makes sense. We've all got one in our pocket and the screens are huge. We can watch, we can listen.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
We'll link to the full report as there is heaps of interesting stuff in there that we don't have time to cover now because we need to get to our chat about Adtech.
We do, yes. Let's move to our Adtech star, Bryan Barletta. He's the founder of Sounds Profitable, a weekly podcast advertising technology newsletter from the Pod News network. Bryan's goal with Sounds Profitable is to put his 12 years of sales engineer and product manager experience to work by detailing how anyone willing to learn can easily become a podcast advertising technology expert themselves.
Welcome, Bryan, to Podcasting Essentials.
Thank you for having me.
It's great for you to be here. Congratulations on the growth of your Sounds Profitable newsletter.
Oh, thank you.
Could we perhaps start with what it is and why you started it?
Yeah, so Sounds Profitable is all about breaking down how podcast advertising technology works. I am weirdly passionate about it. I think it's really fun. Until very recently, I didn't consider myself a creative person. I would have never made my own podcast or anything like that. So I always liked being the right-hand man and help facilitating other people's success. And so to do that, knowing how the tools work and knowing how I can help them make money and be like, go ahead and build the creative thing. I'll make sure that the infrastructure works. That was always my passion. And so I fell into like sales engineer roles where supporting the salespeople selling the products and making sure people are onboarded, and product management roles, building it out based on client requests. And I was at Megaphone for about 10 months. I was at Barometric, which became Claritas before that. So I've been in the podcast ad tech space for about 6 years. I just decided I wanted to try something different. I wanted to try being a sales engineer to everybody, because there's not a good resource for someone who says, well, how does dynamic ad insertion work? How do all these different prefix pixels work for analytics tracking? How does attribution work? And when I turned to the big ad tech publishers or big advertising publishers in the general advertising space, everything read like, oh, podcast ad tech? Not quite yet. And I was like, no, you're wrong. Everybody should come over to this party. So I gave it a shot. And I definitely fully admit that sometimes I'm talking to like mid-level to upper level and I'm not quite breaking it down enough. And that's why I hope people respond. But I want to make this accessible for everyone, and I never want to charge anybody. So thanks to my sponsors, I'm able to write this and do these cool ideas that bring everybody in here and let them learn from it. Let them be smarter in this space.
That's such a good niche that you've cornered. So on that point, most of our audience get excited about creating the podcasts, or that at least is what we try and convince them. So for brands that are looking at producing podcasts, what should they be considering when it comes to ad tech?
Oh, man. Get weird. It's my favorite thing to say. Like, you're in podcasting because it's a different environment and you really should play around with it uniquely, right? My podcast has 14 pieces of dynamic ad insertion. Like, that's goofy. You don't need that many, but I'm doing it because like my creative way to be about it is to say, thanks for listening from Australia. Right? Like I'll add that in there, and based on your geography, I know that, right? There are so many more creative ways to do that, to wrap that in there, to know the time of day that they downloaded the episode, to know what app they're on, all these different things, how many other episodes they've listened to of yours, how many ad placements are in there, and tailor them together. So the biggest thing I would tell brands is that even though they call it dynamic ad insertion, it's ad tech. What it is different ways to use content based on the listener and when they're accessing it. So just because you flight it as a campaign and it tracks like if it's an ad, it could very well be a custom segment. You could determine that your weekly podcast has, or your 5-episode podcast that sits there for all time has like a 2-minute what happened this week or what happened this month, if enough people are going back and downloading it. And through dynamic content, you can put in relevant real-time stuff to an older download. So give somebody on your team 3 days to mess around with it, and a creative person, and you won't regret it. People will be talking about what you do for years.
That's really interesting, Bryan, because I think most people, when they think of dynamic ad insertion, they're thinking about monetizing their podcast by running ads. And for a lot of brands, they don't want to do that because that's not the purpose of the podcast. The purpose is to create a great piece of audio for their audience and build awareness for their brand. So that example there of inserting timely information into back catalog episodes is a great example.
Yeah, I mean, like what you're talking about there is great too, because these brands have something to sell, and that something probably changes every couple of months. So even at a minimum, if that brand sells cars and this podcast is something that people continue to listen to and go back to over and over again, then if you talk about the latest car, that's your insertion, right? Just like a quick 5-minute content piece. Don't make it an ad if you don't want to, but like How do you relate to this podcast with your most recent product in the same content view? Because the vessel is the original episode. And this is a way to sneak in more content about a different part of your brand that's relevant today as opposed to when you recorded it.
Well, Bryan, two terms that we hear a lot, and we've already mentioned them quite a few times already, dynamic insertion and programmatic ads. Without getting too technical, can you explain how it all works?
Yeah. So when an editor is building an episode, they're taking different chunks of audio, right? You might have the intro, you might have the main content, you might have the outro. So 3 pieces. So let's just assume that we put a marker in between each of those 3 pieces. So 2 markers. If I put up a podcast on my hosting platform and those 2 markers are dynamic ad insertion, what it means is even though that's a full file because the editor is edited into one file, at those breakpoints, when the listener presses play to begin the download on the podcast, what's happening is their information is being sent and the hosting platform is saying, I have 2 markers. Are there any ads available that I can fit into those markers relevant to when they press play? So the day, time, all of that, or that specific person. And then they fill it that way so that if me and you were sitting side by side on the same phone, on the same cellular network, we could get different ads because you might have gotten the last impression of an ad that just hit its goal for the day, and I could have gotten the next campaign that was up and running. So I'm in the US and you guys are in Australia. There are different ads targeting the country I'm in versus the country you're in. So it takes advantage of that, even if we both press play right now on the same device, same app. Programmatic is complicated. It's a framework for transacting ads, and that gets overlooked a lot. What a lot of people think of when they think of programmatic is more open marketplace programmatic, which means when that dynamic ad insertion marker happens, instead of me in my hosting platform putting an ad live for when you, the listener, press play, I say to another ad server, hey, here's the listener's information. Do you have an ad you could send to me to put in? And so it's my ad server calling their ad server to see if there's an ad. Programmatic is definitely more expansive than that, but that is the most common part because that's what we think about with like my inventory is available, and it gets a bad reputation because that's considered backfill or remnant inventory because people don't know what they're buying necessarily when they first buy it, and it's usually a lower price because it's the last on their priority list. There's a lot more to it, but definitely that would be a half an hour in the weeds right here, and I want to spare you guys that.
Now, that's a great introduction to it for our audience. Thank you, Bryan. Now, when it comes to placing ads in podcasts, we've often spoken on this podcast about the power of host-read ads. Do you agree they are the most effective?
I think that editors of podcasts, when they step away from it and they just take the ad for whatever it is and insert it in there and don't treat it as a piece of content, that's where advertising fails in podcasting. I think that if an editor had the ability to tell the advertisers or provide a style sheet, like this is how an announcer-read ad should go, this is how someone who's not one of the hosts should speak. I don't want audio. I don't want music. I'm going to layer in my own music. I'm going to change the beat and stuff. I think a good editor could make any ad work if the ad followed a style sheet like we're doing right now. I mean, like you guys have a very clear structure for all of this, right? It's edited and recorded a very specific way. So the idea that an ad isn't a piece of content and doesn't get edited the same way that content does is where ads fall apart. Now, the editor has more control over the two of you, right? So host-read ads are always going to be better. You know the style of your podcast. You don't have to be taught anything new. So with that in mind, host-read ads tend to do better because the audience knows the person, the flow isn't interrupted. It just feels like a piece of content, even if it's a bad piece of content, even if nobody wants to hear about the new shoes you can buy or whatever, they still like you, they like your presentation, they might stick through it, maybe they'll skip it. But if all of a sudden I get to the end of a sentence and there's not even a full second break, and then it's immediately into somebody else's voice that the volumes aren't quite right, or they put some background music, or no one's ever trained them how to advertise to my audience, that's going to fail. And so that's where the kind of disconnect is. Host-read ads succeed because they're treated like content, and the rest of the ads could benefit from an actual content editor participating in their creation.
And I guess being specific too with where you're placing the ads. So one ad fitting in many different podcasts is probably not the right solution.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. My personal pet peeve is when I listen to a new podcast and they don't tell me their name or their show or what we're going to talk about, and they go right into an ad. Like, I don't believe pre-roll is the first thing you hear, because if that's the case, get rid of it. Never serve it. I think pre-roll for me is before the content starts, anytime in the introduction or after the introduction. And that is just a hard one for people to swallow there. But yeah, I mean, putting the same ad in multiple shows, you can't. Maybe record a different announcer-read ad for all your true crime and then all your news and all your sports. Give it a different style per category at least, and I think it'll go further. But I don't think I could be a guest on every podcast, and I'm content. So in the same way, I don't think the same ad fits on every podcast.
So, Bryan, then if brands want to go down the road of host-read ads, how do they go about purchasing that? And do you need a huge budget?
I think that it requires a lot of people power. I think that you're going to have to make a lot of connections. You're either going to have to reach out to publishers directly or networks directly that you want to work with. You're going to have to work with a publisher agency or representation, use a piece of technology to kind of suss out what publishers you want to interact with. The reason why programmatic marketplace is so attractive is because a 20-something buyer that is being woefully underpaid gets to go into a platform that they use every day, like the trade desk. And right next to where they buy the display ads and the video ads and Facebook ads, they just click podcast and they just get to send that audio out and it works. But if they want to do host read, right, they need to basically submit something to each of the podcasts, and there's no clear framework. Right? They might have to send a product to each of them. They have to send the script. They have to check the individual audio. Right now, it's a problem solved with bodies, but the value is absolutely there. When you get into a flow, when you figure out what shows you want to work with or the type of show to identify, it absolutely pays off. And I don't think you need a big budget. You could go with partners like Red Circle or Podgo, and even most recently Podcorn, which was acquired by Entercom. You can work with them and you can look through the list of the publishers that they represent or how they identify them or just provide access to them, and they will give you a custom list of podcasts. They'll reach out on your behalf and handle that middle work for you. And some of them, I mean, I know that Podgo is a sponsor of SoundCartel, and they'll work with anybody of any budget, and it's a really cool way to test it out. And I think the hardest part is that so many of these companies have investment and their entire goal is to generate more revenue. So when someone calls in and is like, hey, I got a couple $100 or a couple $1,000, they're just like, get out of here. I got to wait for the person with $500,000. The companies that can tailor to those people will find success if they can optimize their operations.
So as podcasters, are host-read ads an effective way to drive traffic to your own podcast?
I definitely think so. And I think that it's super underused. Jordan Harbinger was someone I spent a lot of time talking to who spends a lot of money advertising his podcast and other podcasts and has found incredible success. At one of his best points, for every $1 he spent in advertising, he was receiving $3 effectively in people buying into his podcast because it increased his impressions so much and increased his listenership that he could sell for a higher rate, or he had more impressions to fill, which is just incredible. I think the truth of it is podcasters will see a podcast advertising in their podcast far different, right? It's not selling out or whatnot. And so if you go after these smaller podcasts out there that do have a niche audience and are really connected with their community, if you think you could connect with their community too, if you think you can connect with them, buying ads from them is going to help them out and make them feel good because now they have ads on their smaller show. Also, their endorsement means something because maybe they only have a couple hundred listeners, but let's be real. I think that first couple hundred, those people that stick on, might be more meaningful than your first 100,000 because there's more room for people to fall off. There's more transient people. They came in different ways. So if they have a sticky small base, explore it and try it and do trades, right? Don't even pay for it necessarily. Say that like, I'll do a SoundCartel ad in Sounds Profitable and you guys do one here. You can make these offers to people, and the worst case they say is no. In best case, they say yes, and somewhere in between, they offer you an alternative.
Now, I just want to talk about a slightly different topic, measurement and ROI. How does Adtech help in the measurement of advertising effectiveness?
The big thing is that podcasting actually has a lot of data, but we keep comparing it to digital display and Facebook and all these things that get mobile app ID and cookies, both of which are going away, but nobody likes to bring that up when they're complaining about what we don't get in podcasting. If you went to a website right now and it said, will you accept my cookie policy? And you click no, they still get your IP address, your user agent, so they know what web browser you're on or app you're in, and they know the content you're looking at. That's still the info they get. That info is more than enough. And that info is the maximum we get in podcasting. So first, it's privacy focus. We get IP address, which absolutely is personally identifiable information. It can tell if you connected to your household Wi-Fi, but that info alone is enough to be able to track who listened to the podcast and did they take an action on a website that related to the ad. That's the basis of attribution. There are so many great partners about it. They're very privacy focused. They don't send your data externally. You can opt out of them. And the measurement's really cool because instead of focusing on like, hey, we can't measure everybody, so here are some conversions, they built these lift reports. And the focus here is that either based on the campaign or based on all of the podcast listeners they see, they're able to build a control and say your campaign performed good or bad compared to the control that we built. So it's less about like, oh, you drove 5 conversions. It's more about, oh, based on the baseline people you were already getting to your site, you were already converting and buying your things. This podcast brought more new people in or less. You're already overlapping. So the analytics and attribution is really great. It's very accessible, very affordable, and honestly, it's very easy to set up. So I think everybody should really explore it. And always feel free to have conversations with these partners about how they handle data, your privacy rights, and all of that, because most of them are set up to process the data, which means that if they're the processor, it means you own it. And if you own it, learn your rights.
Well, to finish, Bryan, what's on the horizon for podcasting Adtech, or perhaps what would you like to see?
I think that we need to educate more people. I'm so thankful that I found a space here that I can talk about this stuff and experiment, and people will support me doing that. But the truth is I would not be super upset, maybe for like a day or two, if every company pulled their sponsorship and just hired somebody internally to do what I'm doing and educate their teams. I have been an account manager, an ad ops person, a sales engineer a lot, and product manager. And there's been so many companies I've been at that I barely got onboarded to what their product did, let alone the products that they use. And definitely, there were a few companies in the space that I wasn't even told about pod news. I wasn't even told like, hey, we can't tell you what's going on, but read that. We got to educate more people, not just the people that are in here who are not getting treated correctly by their managers and not able to grow in this space. But there are people out there who want to get into podcasting space and don't understand that there's more than just the microphone side and the editing side. And while it says Adtech, I'm a college dropout. Like I went to college for 5 years. I milked that and then I dropped out. I wanted to be a history teacher. So if I can learn it, it's definitely accessible. So I think the big thing that has to come in ad tech really, truly is education, because I think that the gap between someone like myself and the person who needs to be able to become a leader in this space in the next 3 to 5 years is uncomfortably vast. And while it's very cool that like I get to be on cool podcasts talking about this stuff, I'd love more people to nerd out about with this. I'd love it to look a little less cis white male in this space. And I want to educate everybody. And I think the ad tech space is starting to open up on that mindset that they need to do it too.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Bryan, for your time. For those listening, they can check out soundsprofitable.com. And thank you so much for joining us on Podcasting Essentials.
Thank you, Bryan. We've loved chatting. It's been great.
Thanks for having me.
The big takeaway for me in all of that was that we don't need to think about dynamic insertion as just placing ads in other podcasts or allowing ads into our podcast. Bryan talked about that opportunity for producers of podcasts to dynamically insert all sorts of different content. An example that he didn't give, but his own Sounds Profitable podcast actually does that. At the start of each episode, he has a news segment from James Quidland.
Yeah.
And it's the Week in Review. But if you go back and download an episode today of Sounds Profitable from a few months ago, you'll get this week's news.
He really is living the advice that he's giving. The other thing that Bryan was saying was that he'd be more than happy for everyone to be able to build their level of skill and understanding in this area and for his advertisers to pull out. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. It's a very intensive part of the process, and it can be quite technical as well as creative, which is probably why there are very specialist agencies providing these services. But being able to talk about these opportunities with people who really understand the space, like Bryan, is invaluable.
Yeah, and there are huge opportunities that are continually changing because of the advancements in the technology.
That's right. It's actually really exciting.
So you need those skilled people to keep us informed so we can then implement it the best way possible.
That's right.
Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me to explore the world of podcasting Adtech.
I loved it. Thank you, Nick.
For more about us and how we can help you produce a podcast, visit soundcartel.com.au or our socials at SoundCartelAU.
And of course, during these still crazy times, if you're after business insights and inspiration each morning, check out our daily podcast, Business Essentials Daily, wherever you're listening now.
From the team at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.
SoundCartel.